October 2nd, 2023. Our good friend Phil Giraldi joins us now. Phil, always a pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the show. Does the government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu believe that all men are created equal?
Well, I guess that depends on who you talk to in the government. I don't know if Netanyahu himself has ever pronounced on the subject, but several of his top ministers have, and they've indicated that Palestinians are basically a lesser form of life, and removing them from the Jewish state would be a desirable outcome.
And does that racist attitude animate the public policy and the military policy of the government, the Israeli government?
Yeah, sure it does. I mean, it's kind of tied in with how they perceive the security of the state. You know, these are the con jobs that are always pulled when you have a government that wants to do something that ultimately is untenable. And certainly what the Israelis are seemingly are intending to do with Gaza and also on the West Bank, we should be watching that also, they are untenable. This is going to be a genocide, whether you want to call it that. I would assume it'll be carried out in stages, and the first stage would seem to be getting rid of the Palestinians by pushing them into Egypt. And it seems the United States government is cooperating with that objective to a certain extent.
Won't a mass ground invasion of Gaza by Israeli troops, A, be very costly to the Israeli military, 2/3 of which are reservists, and B, arouse serious violent reaction from Israel's neighbors?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. And the question is only one of degree. How far are the players in this willing to go? And that's something we can't predict at this point. And as for the ground invasion is kind of underway. It's not a massive invasion, so it seems more in the nature of probing into the rubble. And of course, you're probably aware that Colonel Douglas Macgregor has reported that there was a major, shall we call it a skirmish, in which the Israelis and some U.S. troops took heavy casualties. Some were killed and some were captured. I am, hoping to get some confirmation of that, if that indeed took place.
Geez, I don't remember the U.S. declaring war on Gaza. As Joe Biden sent ground troops, I'm pretending to play dumb. I'm familiar, of course, with what you said from you and from Colonel Macgregor. Well, how dangerous is that in terms of arousing Israel's neighbors for the U.S. to put ground troops in Israel and make incursions into Gaza?
Well, it basically confirms every idea that they've had about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, that it's so wag the dog, with Israel doing the wagging. There's no reason, there is no threat against the United States from Gaza or from the Palestinians, or for that matter from Lebanon or from Syria or from Iran. So this is all being contrived to create a casus belli, a reason to go to war. And I think that's the way we should kind of view it. Biden is a fool if he's put people on the ground there. But of course, he's also put people on the ground in Ukraine. And we're not at war with Russia either, technically.
Macgregor also reports that the U.S. has taken casualties in Ukraine, and the government hasn't reported it. And the compliant media, including my former bosses, haven't probed about it, haven't asked about it, and certainly haven't reported it. I want to play a clip for you of President Erdogan of Turkey. It appears, Phil, that he's talking to maybe 1 million people in Turkey, and his language is unmistakable and clear. It's in Turkish. There are subtitles. I'll read the subtitles.
Ya İsrail, sen buralara nasıl geldin?
Hey Israel, how did you
Nasıl
come
geldin?
here? How did you enter here?
Sen bir işgalcisin.
You are an occupier. You are
Sen
an
bir
organization.
örgütsün.
Turkish people know this.
Dolayısıyla Türk milleti bunu biliyor. İsrail,
Israel, we
biz de
declare you as a
seni
war criminal to the
savaş
world.
suçlusu olarak dünyaya ilan edeceğiz. Gazze'de savunma değil,
What is being done in
açık ve
Gaza is
alçak
not
bir katliam
defense, but an open
yürütülmektedir.
and despicable
Gazze halkının
massacre.
sergilediği
This
vakur,
determined and faithful stance
kararlı
exhibited
ve
by
inançlı
Gazans
duruş tarihe şanlı bir
will be written in
direniş destanı
history as a
olarak
glorious epic of
yazılacaktır.
resistance. Now, is that going to translate into military operations by the Turks? Is Netanyahu crazy not to take into account the effect on the minds of the masses and the leadership of the countries that are neighbors to Israel in the region?
Yeah, well, you know, Turkey is a significant player. Large population, large economy, relatively speaking, and the second biggest army in NATO. And it's a real army. It's an army that trains, and it's an army that is used to fighting. And but the biggest loss for Israel in this is that Turkey has basically been friendly to Israel. And this is a shot across the bows to Israel that they have far exceeded anything that was appropriate in terms of talking about defense of the country, and that Erdogan is not going to mince any words about it. These people are basically war criminals, and I am quite comfortable with calling our friend Netanyahu and his senior aides war criminals. But here's the big problem. The problem is the United States is funding Israel's war against Gaza. We're accomplices in this. And accomplices in this, you're the lawyer, and makes the United States criminally liable as an accessory to a war crime. So
Right.
This is scary stuff. And Biden must be sleeping when when they're discussing this, because this never should have played out this way.
Is Biden himself making these decisions, or are Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and Lloyd Austin making these decisions?
You know, that's probably one of the really good questions that I don't have an answer to, and I don't know if anyone but maybe a real insider inside the circle person involved in these discussions would know the answer. I think Biden obviously is not mentally sharp, and a lot of his decision making, I think, is just being pushed down the line, and a lot of it is spontaneous, where someone like Blinken thinks he has a brilliant idea, and he says something, the others go along. This is horrific as we're watching this unfold. I mean, absolutely horrific.
Are other leaders in the area, I guess in the Middle East, I guess Turkey is the only member of NATO there, but are other leaders in the area as animated and as willing to condemn as war crimes what Israel is doing as President Erdogan? The King of Jordan, for example, the President of Egypt, for example. We know about the people that run Iran. I'm going to talk to you about Iran in a minute. But are there masses in those countries, and do those countries' leaders share the view of President Erdogan?
Well, I'm pretty sure that most of them share the view, but the question then becomes, how far are they going to go with it in their public utterances? Jordan, for example, the population of Jordan is mostly Palestinians, and certainly the sentiment there is very strong. And Jordan just sent the Israeli ambassador home with instructions for him not to come back. And so that's a very strong move. The Saudis, I'm pretty sure, will take a strong position, but just how strong, I'm not sure. And the Emirates are interesting players in this, because they've had good relations with Israel more or less for some time. If they start going the other way, Israel is going to see that it's going to be paying a huge price for eliminating the Palestinians.
What is the role of the CIA in all of this? On the ground in all these countries, riling up the crowds or finger on the pulse of the crowds, surveilling President Erdogan and the King of Jordan? What is the CIA's mission in this type of powder keg environment in the Middle East?
Well, the thing is, when the level of violence and unrest reaches a certain stage, U.S. diplomats and U.S. intelligence officers kind of lose a lot of their access. I would imagine, having gone through similar situations like this when I was in Turkey, that you sort of back down a little bit, and you start meeting your intelligence contacts in a quiet cafe somewhere. And these guys are people that are in the government and will keep you informed as to how they think things are going. So it's kind of a low-keyed role that I would see as this situation gets more agitated.
But does Langley, meaning CIA brass headquarters, senior people, have a goal, an assignment for the people who now do what you once did?
Well, I think to a certain extent, of course, there's always an objective. And the thing is, it kind of changes as the parameters of what's going on change. And that's the problem with a crisis situation. You can't predict really what's going to be going on the next day. I would think that the decision making is at a higher level than the intelligence agencies per se. I would think that since the director of the agency is the CIA is in the inner cabinet now, these are the people that are meeting and actually setting the objectives. But the State Department and agency operating overseas are kind of in a bad position as this plays out.
Is the CIA on the ground in Gaza?
That's a good question. I would imagine the CIA has sources in Gaza, which is not the same that a guy like me is walking around there. I would think that that's the way it probably plays out. And I would be sure they have cultivated sources over the last 10 years that are still active and probably have some very sexy electronic means of communication. But no, there wouldn't be any CIA people in there. There wouldn't be any State Department people, and there shouldn't be any military people.
Do you expect a drumbeat for war here in the U.S.?
No. I think the Israelis have really, in some ways, blown this one, in that killing little babies by the hundreds or by the thousands is not really going to endear many Americans to what their agenda otherwise might be. And since I think even with our disgusting media, it's become pretty clear that people across the country who are following this issue are expecting that we're going to see something horrific happening in terms of what the Israelis are going to try to do to the Gazan people to get them either to move or to die.
I want to play a clip for you of FBI Director Chris Wray giving some recent testimony in Congress. To me, particularly the second half of this clip, sounds like he was reading from the playbook of Lindsey Graham or Nikki Haley about Iran. Take a listen.
The reality is that the terrorism threat has been elevated throughout 2023, but the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. But it's not just Hamas. As the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, the Iranians, for instance, have directly or by hiring criminals, mounted assassination attempts against dissidents and high-ranking current and former U.S. government officials, including right here on American soil. For example, the cyber targeting of American interests and critical infrastructure that we already see conducted by Iran and non-state actors alike, we can expect to get worse if the conflict expands, as will the threat of kinetic attacks.
As far as you know, realistic or a drumbeat?
I think it's a lot of bull. I think that basically the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism is the United States. I think that all of his presumptions about what's going on in the Middle East, Iran has been the target of terrorism by the United States and Israel, with its scientists assassinated, with its officials being killed by the United States, Soleimani in Baghdad, with support for what the Israelis are doing in Syria, where they're bombing airports, even though they're not at war with Syria, and we are providing them cover. I mean, come on, let's get this straight, Mr. Ray. I know you're getting paid by the people that you want to satisfy by saying what they want to hear, but you are so full of it that I can't even come up with the expletive to describe it.
Good for you, Phil. Good for you. Let's switch to Ukraine. You and I recently read and discussed a devastating piece in Time magazine. Devastating because the Ukrainian senior military and political leadership gave this reporter access to senior people, and he quotes them in saying harshly critical things about Zelensky, who feels betrayed by the West, who is deluded. We're out of options. We're not winning, but you can't tell that to him. What is your feel of what is now the state of affairs in Ukraine?
This was a fascinating article. It's a long article, and I recommend it very strongly. To me, it involved a reporter who actually accompanied Zelensky when he was here in the United States back in September, and then he followed him back to Kiev, where he's clearly spent considerable time and had considerable access to high government officials at all levels. And it's interesting because you read the thing and you come back with the impression that the worm has turned. If you start with the time when Zelensky was in Washington, he was snubbed by virtually everyone. And a little bit of this got out in our media when he was here, but this narrative is compelling. And he came away extremely bitter and obviously ready to blame the Allies, and most particularly the United States, on his troubles. And then there are all kinds of vignettes in the rest of the article where soldiers are talking to this reporter and saying how they don't have any weapons, they don't have the will to fight anymore. And the politicians are interesting too, because he talks to them about things like corruption and how decision making goes on in the government, and everyone is dismissive of it. They say we can't do anything about the corruption. Everyone is stealing everything. So this is a good reason, if Americans need, not to send Ukraine another $60 billion in the latest Biden plan, and to really seriously, let's sit down and negotiate an end to this. Maybe 750,000 of people have been killed already. That's enough.
I'm kind of disgusted by the House of Representatives, the new speaker. As a regular congressman, he steadfastly voted against aid to Ukraine. Now that he's the speaker of the House of Representatives, he's negotiating with the White House to send more money over there. What the hell happens to people when they get in positions of power? How different the world looks from an ivory tower looking out than from the ground looking in. Here's Secretary Austin on Ukraine. It's cut 4, Chris. Now, this is not a political speech. This is an official of the government testifying under oath. Tell me if there's any truth in what you're about to see and hear.
Yet even as we surge support into Israel, we remain focused on Ukraine. Nearly 20 months into Putin's failed campaign of conquest, the Russian military has been badly weakened. Ukraine's brave forces have taken back more than half of the territory seized by Russian invaders since February 2022. And that was made possible by bipartisan and principled U.S. leadership in our coalition of some 50 allies and partners.
Wow.
How can he say that under oath? I can get Lindsey Graham saying it to a crowd to rouse them up. But for the Secretary of Defense to say under oath, part of his legal obligation to tell the truth and report honestly to Congress and public, it's nonsense.
Yeah, it was all nonsense right from the get-go about how badly Russia has been damaged by this. That doesn't seem to go with any of the other reports that we're getting from legitimate journalists. And then the stuff about, we have to keep doing this. And it's, my God, this is, the war is over, General. Let's try to bring a peace that actually will save a few lives and save a few $1 billion for the U.S. taxpayer.
Bill Giraldi, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Of course. More as we get it. Professor Michael Rechtenwald at 2:00 this afternoon. Scott Horton from antiwar.com. Always a pleasure with Scott at 3:30 Eastern this afternoon. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.